Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
Jackson was reviewing some household bills when he heard the insistent knocking at the door. He got up, thinking it was a delivery person, but was met with the desperate face of Noah, the teenage grandson of Mrs. Ellen Turner, the neighbor from across the street. The boy, out of breath, blurted out the words in a rush, almost without air, "My grandma fell. I think she broke her arm." Jackson didn't hesitate. He quickly left the house and went with the boy to her house. The woman was in the backyard, sitting on the ground, clearly in pain. Both arms were awkwardly positioned, and her face showed anguish and shame. She tried to smile to downplay the situation, as if trying to make it seem less serious. Jackson slowly crouched down, assessed her condition, and with great care helped her stand up. Noah ran to open the gate and the car. Jackson carried her to the passenger seat with the utmost care, trying to avoid any sudden movements. On the way to the hospital, the silence between them was heavy. Ellen, with a weak voice, thanked him in low tones, while Noah held her hand in the back seat. Jackson, focused, drove with total attention, but inside, he felt an unease growing. It wasn't because of the accident, it was something he couldn't quite explain. When they arrived, he parked in the emergency spot and ran to get help, while Noah helped his grandmother out of the car. A nurse appeared with a wheelchair, but before he accompanied her to triage, he decided to look for Brooke, his wife, who had worked there for nearly 10 years. He went up to the second floor, where she usually did her administrative shifts. He went straight to the nursing station, but one of her co-workers informed him that Brooke had gone to lunch with Dr. Marcus Lang. That sounded strange, but he just thanked them and headed to the hospital cafeteria, more to confirm than for any other reason. And there they were. Sitting side by side at a secluded table, Brooke smiled while Marcus spoke animatedly, gesturing with his hands. She lightly touched his arm, a gesture that seemed casual but intimate. Jackson stood still, observing for a few seconds. Nothing was explicitly wrong, but something about that scene pierced his chest like a thorn. There was a familiarity between them that went beyond being co-workers. The two laughed, carefree. Jackson took a deep breath and then decided to approach. He crossed the room in silence, his eyes fixed on his wife. Brooke saw him when he was already close to the table. The change in her expression was instant. She froze her laughter and adjusted herself in the chair as if caught off guard. With a forced smile, she said, "Hi, what are you doing here?" Jackson, without beating around the bush, replied, "Ellen, our neighbor, fell. I think she broke her arms. I brought her to the hospital. Her grandson came to get me." Marcus observed everything silently, just holding his juice glass steadily. Brooke quickly stood up, now visibly uncomfortable. "Has she been seen yet? Is she in pain?" she asked while grabbing her bag. Jackson just shook his head and turned around, heading back the way he came. She followed him without saying another word. They went together to the reception, and she tried to speed up the process. Even with the intense movement, she managed to talk to a colleague, and within minutes a doctor came to examine Ellen. Jackson stayed close during the entire evaluation, attentive to every reaction from the woman. She endured the pain with dignity, but her suffering was evident. When Ellen was taken for tests, he looked for Noah, who was still anxiously waiting near the chairs. He went to the cafeteria, bought a sandwich and a juice, came back, and handed it to the boy, who thanked him almost in a whisper. They sat together for a few minutes. "She slipped on the water in the garden," Noah explained. "She was watering the plants, tripped on the hose, tried to get up, but started crying, and I got scared to move her, so I ran to get someone." Jackson placed his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You did the right thing." And while comforting the boy, he also tried to calm his own mind, which kept replaying that scene in the cafeteria like a broken record. While waiting for Ellen to finish her tests, Jackson remained silent. Noah dozed off next to him, the sandwich still half-eaten. Jackson crossed his arms, looked around, but all he could see was inward. That scene in the cafeteria had affected him more than it should have, but pretending it was just a minor detail would be lying to himself. The truth is, what he saw didn't start there. It was just the confirmation of a long sequence of signs he had preferred to ignore for too long. From the first months with Brooke, there were issues he brushed aside with good intentions. The name Aaron Blake, for example, came up too early, and with too much weight. An ex who always appeared in conversations, in the compliments she casually dropped. He was great at this. Aaron taught me to like this place. This song reminds me of a trip with him. Jackson smiled, changed the subject, and tried not to feed insecurities. Deep down, he believed love was also about giving space for the other person's memories. But that space kept growing until it became an entire room where he no longer felt comfortable. When he confronted Brooke for the first time about it, she said it was just nostalgia, that talking about the past didn't mean wanting to relive it. He believed her. But trust, when wounded slightly multiple times, doesn't bleed all at once. It opens up slowly, like an invisible crack. Gradually, he began to notice the slips, deleted notifications, laughter at the phone followed by weak excuses, messages answered at odd hours. Brooke never admitted anything beyond friendship. She said Aaron was in another city, another life, that their contact was just polite. And Jackson, caught between pride and the desire to keep the marriage working, swallowed his discomfort and smiled at family gatherings, even when everything inside him screamed that something was off. Over time, the silences between them grew longer. Conversations that were once light and spontaneous turned into practical exchanges, almost always about bills, commitments, or what was in the fridge. Brooke continued with her busy life at the hospital, and Jackson tried to convince himself that this distance was natural. But there was a difference between routine and absence. And he felt like he was being left behind, as if his wife was building a new version of her life without space for him. When Marcus entered the picture, the pattern repeated. First, technical compliments. He's excellent at what he does. Then, inside jokes. You should hear his stories. Finally, small lies about extra shifts that, coincidentally, matched the hours of the new coworker. Trust was already worn out, so it took little to raise doubts. But Brooke always knew how to play with words. She always had the talent to flip conversations, to make Jackson feel exaggerated, controlling, jealous without reason. And he, for years, believed the problem was himself. That he was too sensitive. That he was looking for flaws where there weren't any. Until the day he accidentally found a message on her phone. Nothing explicit, but enough. Marcus had said, "Our conversation yesterday did me good, I hope you feel lighter too." Brooke responded with a heart emoji and a, "You're always my safe harbor." When Jackson questioned her, she said they were talking about the recent death of Marcus's father and that he needed support. Jackson wanted to believe her. But something had already changed inside him. He had stopped trying to convince himself. That lunch at the hospital, that light touch on the arm, that smile she hadn't given him in months, this wasn't just about a lunch. It was about everything that came before. Every excuse. Every denial. Every attempt to make him doubt his own intuition. Jackson realized that, even without kisses or confessions, something had broken. And what hurt the most was realizing it wasn't a sudden break. It was something he had allowed to happen gradually, out of fear of facing the truth. And while Ellen remained hospitalized and Noah slept exhausted, Jackson understood that it wasn't just a marriage in crisis. It was a story being written without him, where his presence was no longer necessary, where his name was no longer mentioned with affection. Understanding this didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. Enough clarity to realize that loving someone who has already left emotionally is like insisting on living in a place where only furniture remains, because the people, the emotions, moved out a long time ago. Jackson left the hospital with a tense body and a heavy mind. He walked to the car without saying goodbye to Brooke. It wasn't necessary. Both knew something had changed there. He started the engine, adjusted the rearview mirror, and for a moment, he kept his hands on the wheel without moving. The engine purred softly, but he wasn't in a hurry to leave. What he felt was like standing at an emotional crossroads, where continuing would require ignoring what he saw, what he felt, and who he had become after years of losing himself in a marriage that no longer embraced him. He got home, dropped the keys on the entryway table, and went straight to the bedroom. He sat on the edge of the bed. He was exhausted, but the exhaustion wasn't physical. It was mental. He carried a silent sadness and a weight that had been accumulating for years. That feeling of being married to someone who had slowly drifted away, with the skill of leaving without walking out the door. He thought about Brooke, the promises made, the early conversations, how she used to say they would face everything together. But the truth was that he had been facing many things alone, while she built another story within the same house, surrounded by excuses that sounded increasingly rehearsed. It was then that, on an ordinary afternoon, he decided to call his daughter, Grace. The call didn't have a dramatic tone, nor was it made in a hurry. He wanted to talk. He needed to hear someone who wouldn't judge him, who wouldn't try to paint a rosy picture over the mess. Grace answered with her usual calm voice and, upon hearing her father, stayed silent for a few seconds. Then she said firmly, "Dad, you've always been the pillar of our home. But pillars also need support. And if you feel this is destroying who you are, maybe it's time to rebuild somewhere else." That stayed with him. It wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was the truth. That same week, Jackson met with a lawyer. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was a choice based on years of accumulated frustration. He told everything calmly. He explained that there was no proof of physical infidelity, but that the relationship was already emotionally destroyed. That he felt like a stranger in his own home, ignored, replaced by someone else even though he was present every day. The lawyer listened, took notes, and explained the steps. When he left the office, Jackson felt a mix of relief and fear. Relief for taking the first step. Fear for knowing that, from that point on, there would be no turning back. He returned home, opened the door, and found Brooke scrolling through her phone, sitting on the couch. She greeted him without looking up from the screen. He sat in the armchair next to her, stared for a few seconds, and said, with a calm but firm tone, "I talked to a lawyer." Brooke, confused, raised her face. "A lawyer? Why?" Jackson kept his gaze steady. "I'm filing for divorce." Her reaction was a mix of shock and anger. At first, she laughed, as if thinking it was a bad joke. Then she tried to argue. She said he was exaggerating, that they were just going through a rough patch, that she had been stressed with work, that she hadn't done anything wrong. Jackson listened to everything, but inside him, the decision was already sealed. In the following days, Brooke tried to reverse the situation. She changed her tone. She asked for conversations, cried, said she needed to be heard. She talked about internal crises, feeling lonely and pressured. She tried to frame the problem as emotional confusion. She said she had never cheated on him physically, that Marcus was just a coworker who listened to her, that it never went beyond that. Jackson didn't interrupt her at any point. He let her speak. But at the end, he responded with the calmness of someone who no longer carried doubts. "I've been alone in this marriage for too long. And even when I tried to talk, you weren't here anymore. I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing this for myself." She tried one last appeal. She said she still loved him, that they could try therapy, that he was being hasty. But Jackson no longer saw love there. He saw only the desperation of someone who realized too late that his presence was a choice, and that he had chosen to leave. The process officially began that week. Brooke signed the papers with the same expression of someone losing something they thought they had under control. And Jackson, for the first time in years, slept in peace. Without needing to guess messages, force smiles, or pretend everything was okay. He didn't have certainties about what was coming, but he finally had something he hadn't felt in a long time, the freedom to breathe lightly. The confirmation he was missing arrived without warning. Jackson was in a friend's office, drinking coffee and finishing some tasks, when he received a message on his phone. It was a photo sent by Patrick, an old colleague who worked at the same hospital as Brooke. "Sorry to send this, but I thought you should see it." It was a clear image, with no questionable angles or double meanings. Marcus was in the car, in the back parking lot of the hospital. Brooke was in the passenger seat, leaning toward him. They were laughing. Her hands rested naturally on his leg. Her face was very close to his. Too close for any professional excuse. Jackson stared at the photo for a few minutes, as if his eyes were trying to deny what his heart already knew. But there was no more room for doubts or hopes. This was just the final piece of a puzzle he had been putting together for a long time. It didn't hurt the way he imagined it would. It hurt in a colder, more resolved way. It was like watching the end of a movie you already know how it ends, but you still need to see until the last second to close the story with dignity. He didn't reply to the message. He simply saved the image and put the phone away. He finished his cup of coffee in silence, looked at the clock, and told his friend he needed to go. He drove to the notary's office, picked up the documents from the lawyer, and filed the final part of the process. He had already made the decision, now he was just making it official. Brooke still resisted, still sent messages trying to understand where he had gone wrong, still asked for another chance, still talked about trying again. But Jackson didn't respond. He kept his silence as a form of protection. The phase of words was over. On the day the papers were signed, Brooke arrived at the lawyer's office accompanied by a friend. She looked worn out, with subtle makeup and neatly arranged clothes, as if that could save some part of her image in front of him. When they sat at the table to sign the documents, she didn't say anything. She didn't ask for explanations or contest anything. She just read, signed, and avoided eye contact. In the end, she said quietly, "I thought we could still fix things." Jackson responded with just a firm look. This wasn't about fixing anymore. It was about respect. In the following days, Jackson packed his things calmly. He took some books, paintings from his daughter, basic clothes. He left behind furniture, photos, birthday gifts. Everything that carried memories, he left in the place where they had been lost. He moved to a smaller house, farther away. He spent the first few days there almost in silence. He slept early, woke up early, walked the streets with heavy thoughts. But there was, albeit subtle, a sense of lightness. He no longer needed to fake smiles, guess lies, or measure his words. Brooke's absence was a relief rather than emptiness. Over time, he reconnected with some old bonds. Friends who had drifted away due to routine or the way the marriage isolated him. One of these reunions was with Rachel Sanders, a friend from college days, a widow for several years and mother of 2 adult children. They ran into each other by chance at a supermarket. The conversation, which started timidly, soon gained momentum. She always had that direct but caring way about her. Someone who knew how to listen without rushing, but also without pretending. They started meeting more often, without commitment, without plans. It was just companionship, but a companionship that embraced without judgment. With her, Jackson didn't need to explain himself. It was enough to just be. During one of these conversations, Rachel mentioned that she had once worked at the same hospital where Marcus worked shifts. She said it naturally, as if talking about a familiar name. Jackson listened in silence. Rachel recounted that Marcus had been involved with other women in relationships, always approaching them with a charming demeanor and pretending emotional understanding. Many stories ended in confusion, estrangements, and gossip that was quickly hushed up by hospital politics. Jackson wasn't surprised. It was the kind of profile that knew how to blend in. And Brooke, with her vulnerability disguised as confidence, had been the perfect target. That information didn't spark anger. It just brought a sense of confirmation. A few weeks later, Grace, his daughter, mentioned that Brooke had tried to talk to her. She sent messages asking if Jackson was okay, if he said anything, if she could try to get closer again. She said Marcus had shown himself to be a different person, distant, cold. Brooke talked about missing him, about starting over, said she regretted it, that maybe she had gotten everything confused. Grace relayed what she heard without taking sides. She knew her father needed to hear, but she also knew he wasn't the same man who tolerated emotional crumbs anymore. Jackson listened to everything without reacting. Then he smiled, closed his eyes for a moment, and said, "She had everything and chose less. Now, I've chosen peace." There was no anger in his voice, no pride. Just firmness. That chapter was closed. Brooke was part of the past, not out of revenge, but for survival. He had relearned to put himself first. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that every step he took came from a conscious choice. He was building a life that didn't need permission or validation. It was his. And that was enough.
Suspicious of your wife or daughter-in-law? Don't go through what we saw in the video. Check the link in the comments and get the ebook with valuable tips and investigator-approved sites to clear your doubts.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.